See if that helps. Okay, we pinned it to the profile. We'll close out of that. And we'll see if this works. Do 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 do. We need some starting music. I wish I could play Akira the Don, but then it gets flagged, I think, in YouTube. We will be starting Philosophy of Mind intro in just a few moments. Okay, this one's good. The continuation of Philosophy of Mind will be starting in about 20 seconds. Well, here's a good meme. We'll read this one. Sisyphus is rolling a boulder towards the Grand Hilbert Hotel. The hotel has an infinite number of rooms, but they are all full, so they may not be able to accommodate him or his boulder. If you choose to divert him, his boulder will destroy the ship of Theseus, but the ship has had all of its constituent parts replaced, so it might not actually be the same ship. Is Sisyphus happy? Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we are picking up where we left off. This is the Backbone 101 course for the year one material. In it, there are 8 sections. and there are other courses that branch off of it. So this section of this course is mind body problem. We talk a little bit about identity and mortality or immortality as well, but it's mostly just restricted to the mind body problem. It counts as the intro to the intro to philosophy of mind, which is a course that we'll be starting as soon as we are done with these recordings. We have, I think, 8 more essays to read, and then we'll be starting the full-time philosophy of mind course, where we'll get into AI and reductionism and challenges to materialism and functionalism and behavioralism and all sorts of really cool things. The qualia problem. I think of all the subjects in philosophy, the philosophy of mind has the most interesting thought experiments. So we'll be doing that after we're done with this. We have finished 2 really long sessions, and thank you, Elena, for your great questions and your engagement in this, because it's been a blast doing this the second time around. And we really, really, really dove into David Hume's essay. And now we're going to read another essay on the nature and origin of our notion of personal identity by Thomas Reid, who's going to push back against those things that David Hume was saying. So let's begin. Of identity in general. The conviction which every man has of his identity as far back as his memory reaches needs no aid of philosophy to strengthen it, and no philosophy can weaken it without first producing some degree of insanity. That's that's quite an interesting and good observation, don't you think? It's like if there's the if there's the two ingredients that we were talking about that make up everything, and we exist in the mean between them, that infinite chaotic potential on the one side is, well, that's insanity, and there is a degree of it. And so it's not that David Hume doesn't occupy a real place when he's refusing to leave the cave and also refusing to acknowledge the wall or himself in the cave. It's the shadows and nothing else. Well, there's a germ of truth in there. Okay, but it's also quite insane. So he says, the philosopher, however, may very properly consider this conviction as a phenomenon of human nature worthy of his attention. If he can discover its cause, an addition is made to his stock of knowledge. If not, it must be held as a part of our original constitution or an effect of that constitution produced in a manner unknown to us. Okay, so we all have this sense. He's starting out. We all have this sense of ourselves, that thing that David Hume denied, this idea that, well, I know I've got memory stretching back, there's a me. He says, so either we'll figure out where that comes from or we won't. And if we don't figure out where it comes from, either it comes from something we just can't figure out or haven't figured out yet, or it's just a part of our constitution. It's basic, basically, right? We've talked about the word basic quite a lot now. It's come up. We haven't actually talked about it, but it's come up a lot. It's groundation. There's no arguing to it. It's just there. Okay. That we may form as distinct a notion as we are able of this phenomenon of the human mind, it is proper to consider what is meant by identity in general, what by our own personal identity, and how we are led into that invincible belief and conviction that every man has his own personal identity as far as his memory reaches. Identity in general, I take, so he's going to talk about all 3 of those things now. Okay, so first, identity in general, I take to be a relation between a thing which is known to exist at one time and a thing which is known to have existed at another time. If you ask whether they are one and the same or 2 different things, every man of common sense understands the meaning of your question perfectly. Whence, we may infer with certainty that every man of common sense has a clear and distinct notion of identity. If you ask a definition of identity now, so that's interesting because you wouldn't expect that argument, but with the background of David Hume, we can see, remember David Hume saying, there's something wrong with what I'm saying. Like the argument eats itself and it doesn't really work. And I think he's touching on that right here. He's saying, look, the fact that you can understand, the fact that you can understand, not the answer to the question, the fact that you can comprehend clearly what I mean by, are you the same person as you were in the past, that former sense of self that you had, and your current self? Whether that's true or not, the fact that you can even comprehend it means it can't possibly not be true, right? Because if everything really was just utter chaotic mess, how could you even have the idea of something that isn't like that? Where did that idea come from? Okay. If you ask a definition of identity, I confess I can give none. It is too simple a notion to admit of logical definition. We talked about the idea of simple before, but we'll come back again. I can say it is a relation, like you said a moment ago, but I cannot find words to express the specific difference between this and other relations, though I am in no danger of confounding it with any other. I can say that diversity is a contrary relation, and that similitude and dissimilitude are another couple of contrary relations, which every man easily distinguishes in his conception from identity and diversity. I see evidently that identity supposes an uninterrupted continuance of existence. Right. So I can't give you a definition. It's too simple an idea, but I can tell you what he said before. It's a relation. It's like in a relation between the idea I have of my former self and my idea of myself now, different things. But there's a similarity there. There's an identity in there, right? It's a relationship between those two things. But I can't give you a definition beyond that. And I can see clearly that it's not like other relations. Like I could say, this is red and that's red, and so they share something in common, or this is a fork and that's a subset of the things that are silverware or something like that. But he says I can identify it as the opposite of a different relation, which would be the uh diversity, or what's the word he uses there? Relation. Diversity, yeah, diversity as a contrary relation, right? It's there's a oneness in the idea and the way that they relate to each other. I can see that clearly. I can't really exactly define it for you, but I know what I'm talking about, even though I can't tell you exactly with a definition.
Okay, may I cut you off for a moment?
Hmm.
Up to this point, it is like he is arguing in favor of quote unquote the I am, because from the way that I have things structured in my mind of terms and concepts and notions, identity until now it was the structure, the system of beliefs, and maybe you can add the principles that you choose to add to that structure, and that's my quote unquote identity, which is not exactly the same as the structure of self, because the self is that inner landscape that we discussed at the previous session. But up to this point, it seems that Reed is in favor and tries to map or to argue in favor of the I am, of the entity.
I think that's right. I think that is what he's getting at, or what he's trying to get at. Yeah,
There is a
I think.
fine line between the identity, the way that he advocates in favor of or tries to argue in favor of his perception perspective, but it feels like he is just explaining the I am in a philosophical way. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think so. It's not clear yet from what we've read if he understands that that's what he's getting at, but I know the idea that you're talking about, and I think that is exactly what it's going to ultimately depend upon. So let's see. Maybe he knows all that. Maybe he's going to agree or disagree explicitly with that idea. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think you're onto something there. So that's a good question for us to keep in mind as we, one, try to see if that works out to be necessary, and two, if it works out that he identifies that in his theory, or if he identifies it and then argues against it or whatever. So we'll keep both questions in mind. I think that's right. And that's, of course, that I am idea is, of course, the other ingredient in being, right? It's the exact, I mean, you obviously know that for bringing it up, I think, but th- that's that other aspect. Okay. So I see evidently. So now he's going to talk. I don't exactly give a definition, but here's something I do know. I do know that identity supposes an uninterrupted continuance of existence. That which has ceased to exist cannot be the same with that which afterwards begins to exist. For this would be to suppose a being to exist after it ceased to exist, and to have had existence was before it was produced, which are manifest contradictions. Continued uninterrupted existence is therefore necessarily implied in identity. Hence, we may infer that identity cannot, in its proper sense, be applied to our pains, our pleasures, our thoughts, or any operation of our minds. Yeah, he's like a photographic negative of David Hume, right? David Hume is saying the only thing I know are these perceptions. So that's all I am, is whenever the perception's happening, that's what I know of me existing. But I've never perceived myself directly, so I can't say there's a self. He's saying, look, let's just look at the idea of self. You know what I'm talking about. And it's hard to imagine a way you could actually attack that. In other words, he's hinting, like, I think I agree with you, David Hume. Your attack didn't actually fully work. But beyond that, he's saying, okay, I can't give you a definition, but I know a few things about it. And one of the things is that it implies an uninterrupted continuance of existence. And this is him using the philosophical tool of saying, look, if it's not that, it leads to contradiction. So if something's self-contradictory in philosophy, almost always we give it up. Occasionally, there are philosophers who will try to argue that you can have a system of thought that negates the law of non-contradiction, but that's it's not clear if that works. We will look at some essays by that, not in this section, I don't think, but um, when we do philosophy of mind, I think we will look at least we'll point at some people arguing like that. But in any case, so he's making that argument. He's saying, look, that's going to lead to contradictions. It can't possibly be the case. They're manifest contradictions. So the idea itself, which we know to be true, not because we're assuming it's true, we know it's true for the reasons that he gave, can only be true if also it's true that yourself is uninterrupted in its continuance of existence. Hence, we may infer that identity cannot, in its proper sense, be applied. Oh, and so then he's concluding, right? So he's starting with examining the idea and seeing that it's real, and then seeing what the consequences are, to then conclude the exact opposite of David Hume's starting point, which is the only things I know come through my senses, and those things are all perceptions. And I've never perceived the thing that's doing the perceiving. So I pop into existence every time I have a feeling or a thought, and then I pop out of existence whenever so he gets to the opposite conclusion by starting from the opposite starting point. Okay. So pains, pleasures, thoughts, operations of the mind. The pain felt this day is not the same individual pain which I felt yesterday, though they may be similar in kind and degree and have the same cause. The same may be said of every feeling and of every operation of mind. They are all successive in their nature, like time itself, no two moments of which can be the same moment. It is otherwise with the parts of absolute space. They always are and were and will be the same. So far, I think we proceed upon clear ground in fixing the notion of identity in general. So, one of the things that we've noticed different writing styles from different authors. One of the things that's quite impressive is that about Thomas Reid, it's impressive, or you could dislike it. It depends on the style. But one of the features of the way he writes is he really does, and this is why I keep pausing in ways that I didn't usually pause, um, is that he makes really um, the formal version of his argument is a very strong philosophical argument based in logic. And yet, typically, to illustrate that strong of an argument, an author would use 3 or 4 or 5 paragraphs. So we've already hit that a couple of times. I've just identified that that's what he's doing, which is why we have to keep stopping. So let's take a look at this one. He says, "Okay, look, I know I know that this identity has to be an uninterrupted thing. It would be self-contradictory in the consequence if it wasn't." And then he says, again, he's exact opposite direction as David Hume. He says, "Well, the pain I felt yesterday is not the same as the pain I feel today. So since there is a sameness, whatever this thing that is me is, it's not the perceptions. The perceptions can't be what I am, because what I already know about what I am through my logical examination of the ideas is something that isn't changing and continuing through time. I mean, maybe it changes, but the thing itself doesn't stop existing, and it isn't Well, that's a good question. We'll keep in mind of whether or not something like that can change. Maybe the self he's talking about, the I that he's talking about, is fundamentally an unchangeable thing. We'll see where he goes with that. But in any case, that thing stays the same. And since all of the perceptions are different, even if I stub my toe in the exact same way on the exact same day in 2 different years, the second time it happens, I have the memory of the first time. The second time it happens, it's a different toe. Like everything's different. So what he's saying is, since I've identified a sameness that I know exists, I know for sure that whatever it is, it's disconnected from. It doesn't rely on its existence or for its definition on any of the perceptions, because all of them are varied and not the same. And then he makes this argument that they're all successive in their nature, like time. No two moments could be the same moment. There's a cool sentence he could have had a paragraph on, right? Okay, examine your concept of a moment. There's no way that two moments could be the same moment. That's just one moment. He says that's not true of absolute space. So the location XYZ or whatever, he thinks that those things might they might be something that, any two of them could be the same thing. It's not clear how that's the case, but he's saying of the fundamental ideas of time and space and maybe matter or being or something like that, time at least is always successive and it can't possibly be understood without succession. It has succession sewn into it. And he says this notion of me, of the self, is exactly like that and not like any other fundamental idea, which maybe wouldn't be that way. They always are and were and will be the same. So far, I think we proceed upon clear ground in fixing the notion of identity in general. It's a general idea of an identity. Now he moves on. Of our idea of personal identity, it is perhaps more difficult to ascertain with precision the meaning of personality, but it is not necessary in the present subject. It is sufficient for our purpose to observe that all mankind place their personality in something that cannot be divided or consist of parts. Now that's the philosophical word simple that we had seen in our discussions of God's existence and maybe in some other sections of this 101 course that we've been doing. The idea of simple is something that's simple does not have a left or a right side. It doesn't have an up or a down. It's not made of parts at all. It's a oneness thing. And again, for the second time now, he's saying, look, I don't have a definition. I don't have a definition of self or identity in general, and I don't have a definition of individual personality, but I don't need that in order to do philosophical investigation. I can say, well, what do I know about it, even if I don't have that all encompassing definition? And the first thing he says is that it's sufficient for our purposes to simply observe that all mankind place their personality in something that cannot be divided or consists of parts. Now, he isn't saying that proves it's true, right? All he's saying is, let's take a look. Let's take a look at the fact that people think about it in this way. A part of a person is a manifest absurdity. When a man loses his estate, his health, his strength, he is still the same person and has lost nothing of his personality. If he has a leg or an arm cut off, he is the same person he was before. The amputated member is no part of his person. Otherwise, it would have a right to a part of his estate and be liable for a part of his engagements. It would be entitled to a share of his merit and demerit, which is manifestly absurd. A person is something indivisible and is what Leibniz called a monad. So we won't go off on the fun tangent of Leibniz and monads right now. Let's pause for a minute on this latest argument. We're seeing him use a lot of the same thinking style and reasoning, and he's saying, "Look, I don't have a definition, but I'm going to tell you something about we're going to discover something about these topics through examination of how people think about it or what the logical consequences of the idea are." It occurs to me that there are certainly philosophers who could disagree with the evidence he's brought forward in this last paragraph in order to make his case. Now, the typical common sense view, right? The vulgar view, as we read in the last essay. What's a better word for it? The folk philosophy, the folk conception of mind would say, well, yeah, of course, if I lose my house, I'm still the same person. I'm just maybe sad or something, but that's the same person. If I lose a leg, I'm still the same person. Um, I'm not sure he's given reasons why we should have to believe that's the case. And well, he does. He gives one reason first. He says, if that wasn't the case, then your leg would be able to sue you for a part of your estate, right? Because so m- so let's see. There's a sense in which that might not be the case, but maybe it makes it clear that what he's talking about is the kind of self that is not something that is divisible or changeable in those sorts of ways. Okay, so the self he's after is the type of thing that can't be cut into pieces and doesn't have any parts. My personal identity, therefore, implies, again, I'm not sure if he's proven that yet, but okay. My personal identity, therefore, implies the continued existence of that indivisible thing which I call myself. Whatever this self may be, it is something which thinks and deliberates and resolves and acts and suffers. I am not thought. I am not action. I am not feeling. I am something that thinks and acts and suffers. My thoughts and actions and feelings change every moment. They have no continued, but a successive existence. But that self or I to which they belong is permanent and has the same relation to all the succeeding thoughts, actions, and feelings, which I call mine. Such are the notions I have of my personal identity, but perhaps it may be said, this may all be fancy without reality. How do you know? What existence have you? Or I'm sorry, what evidence have you that there is such a permanent self which has a claim to all the thoughts, actions, and feelings which you call yours? So once again, we see he's a photographic negative of everything that David Hume was trying to argue for. He's saying, look, David Hume is saying, look, thinking is happening. I don't know that I am thinking, right? The feeling is happening. It doesn't mean that there's an I that has the feeling. So far, what Reed is saying is, look, we understand if we understand anything about the self, let's start by examining what it is we're talking about. We know that it never changes, and we know that all those perceptions change. So whatever we're talking about with the self, it ain't those perceptions. Therefore, well, maybe I shouldn't cartoonify his argument by just jumping to say therefore, but at some point he gets to the conclusion because there's a continued existence of the self and there's not a continued existence of these various perceptions, they pop in and they go away and the pain is over and a new pain happens, like that type of thing. Then there's a distinction to be made, and the self that is having the perceptions is distinct. You can't just be defined by the thoughts you're having. You have to be a thing having the thoughts. So it's just exactly the opposite of David Hume's perspective. And he got now it's we can notice that they're taking two different paths, right? David Hume, it seems to me, is presuming that you can only know things through the senses. He doesn't, at least in the essay that we read, give an argument for that fact. I'm sure he does somewhere. But what Reed is doing is saying, well, look, let's just examine the ideas themselves and see what their consequences are. Now, some people might say, wait a minute, you're just saying I have a notion and then this is what the notion is like. That doesn't prove that you're accurate and true in your understanding. It just means that you have this idea. And like he's saying right now, it could be a fantasy for all you know. But that's not all he's doing, right? When he's saying, let's look at the ideas and see what they imply, he's saying some things like you can't possibly imagine if the world is not like this at all, how can you even have an idea like this? Which relates to we could talk about this really quickly just to show that that argument is a really it's a more impressive argument than it might sound at first. I know of narwhals, I know of horses, right? I know of rhinoceroses, so I can imagine a unicorn. I've engaged with and experienced in the world things that are like horses and things that have horns on them. So a unicorn doesn't have to exist for me to have the idea of it. I've experienced gold and I've seen mountains and I can imagine a gold mountain even if no gold mountain ever exists. However, Try to imagine something that isn't like anything in the world. Come up with something that's not like anything in the world that you can actually imagine, right? You could name things that are absurd, right? I could name a square circle, for instance. That doesn't exist anywhere in the world, but it also doesn't even exist in my imagination, right? I'm using words to point at something that I can't actually even look at in my imagination. You see the right? There's a difference there. So the evidence is how could there how could it be that I have an idea of something that's simple without parts and not complicated that doesn't cease to exist but continues in its existence at least as long as I do but Descartes uses this argument for the existence of God. He says this idea of something that is not like anything I am and not like anything I've ever experienced. Well, there must just be something like that I have experienced without knowing that I did in some way. It's also obviously he's plagiarizing Plato, Socrates' argument, right? I mean, we don't have to spell that out because I know you know that, but are you jumping up and down that you just heard Socrates' argument there hidden in Descartes? He's saying, it's not like nothing else is like this, and so I must have experienced to even have the ability to know it or to be oriented towards it. Okay, well, he's doing that here. He's doing similar types of arguments and reasoning. In part, he's doing other things too, like looking for contradictions and the consequences and stuff like that. But that's without a doubt, I think, a legitimate philosophical move. It's a really impressive one, and he's doing things like that just to look at ourselves and what it means about the self that we might have. All right. So now he's saying, well, what if this is all mistaken? What if these ideas are all just ideas that we have, and who knows how we got them, but they're not true? So he says to answer this, that the proper evidence I have of all this is remembrance. Uh-oh. I remember that 20 years ago I conversed with such a person. I remember several things that passed in that conversation. My memory testifies not only that this was done, but that it was done by me who now remembers it. If it was done by me, I must have existed at that time and continue to exist from that time to the present. If the identical person whom I call myself had not a part in that conversation, my memory is fallacious. It gives a distinct and positive testimony of what is not true. Every man in his senses believes what he distinctly remembers, and everything he remembers convinces him that he existed at the time he remembered. Although memory gives the most irresistible evidence of my being the identical person that did such a thing. Again, we'll just it's clear what his argument is and it's clear why it's powerful, but we'll flush out the formality of it a little bit and just say, look, the thing I'm looking for is the thing that doesn't change. I could be wrong in some of my memories, all of my perceptions are changing, all of that. But just the fact that I remember being a person that had that experience means I must have not stopped existing and then popped into existence again later. There's a connection there of something unbroken. Although memory gives the most irresistible evidence of my being the identical person that did such a thing at such a time, I may have other good evidence of things which befell me and which I do not remember. I know who bare me and suckled me, but I do not remember these events. It may here be observed, though the observation would have been unnecessary if some great philosophers had not contradicted it, that it is not my remembering an action that of mine that makes me be the person who did it. This remembrance makes me to know assuredly that I did it, but I might have done it, though I did not remember it. That relation. All right. So another thing that's important is that he's got a qualifier in the last paragraph where he says, the things I distinctly remember. Right. And this is language borrowed from Descartes. Okay. So there's a difference between a clear and distinct understanding and something that might be flawed, right? Like my eyes deceive me when I'm looking at an optical illusion. It happens all the time. I could be having a hallucination or something like that. But when the circumstances are set up so that even if I'm wrong, right, it doesn't mean that I'm certainly right. It could be that I'm in a brain in a vat somewhere and I'm being deceived by an all powerful demon, right? It's not like Descartes said this proves something is correct just because it feels like it's distinct. But he says, when I clearly and distinctly perceive something, I at least know the quality of the idea in my mind. And all he's relying upon here is that the idea in my mind is of a self that is the same self as who I am today or connected in some way. Whether I changed or not, I didn't stop existing and then some new thing started existing. And the proof of that is just that even if 99% of my memories are flawed, if I have a clear and distinct memory of absolutely anything, I remember I used to live in New York. Okay. I clearly remember going to this pizza shop, something like that in New York. That that should be enough, he thinks, for us to show that there is an unbrokenness in some aspect of who you are, and that's what he wants to call the self. And and then he's saying, look, don't make the mistake of thinking that what I'm saying is that's what makes you unbroken, right? You could lose your memory entirely and no longer even know that you were a self in the past, but you still were that self. When you have a memory, now you have all the evidence you need to know, oh, selves are like this. They're things that don't stop existing in between moments where they exist for sure, right? That's all we need to know. Anybody who can have a memory knows enough to know that there's a continuity of something. Let's call that the self. To say that my remembering that I did such a thing, or as some choose to express it, my being conscious that I did it, makes me to have done it, appears to me as great an absurdity as it would be to say that my belief that the world was created made it to be created, right? Don't get confused. I'm not saying that because you can remember something, that's what makes you be the same self. There's all sorts of things you don't remember, but there was a you that was in those places doing those things. How do we know? Well, one of the ways we know is that you do have some memories. So all your perceptions change. You go to sleep. You seem to not exist if you're David Hume, and you come back into awakened consciousness, and yet you have the memory of what happened before that. So you didn't. What there's something about you that doesn't stop existing through all of that. When we pass judgment on the identity of other persons than ourselves, we proceed upon other grounds and determine from a variety of circumstances which sometimes produce the firmest assurance and sometimes leave room for doubt. The identity of persons has often furnished matter of serious litigation before tribunals of justice, but no man of a sound mind ever doubted of his own identity as far as he distinctly remembered. The identity, so he says, no man in the world, even David Hume, he's saying, even David Hume, when he remembers something he did last year, doesn't really doubt that that there's something consistent and unbroken about who he is. Now, David Hume asserts that he denies that, but Reed is saying no man can doubt, or no man of sound mind. So maybe he's saying David Hume is insane. Okay, the identity of a person is a perfect identity wherever it is real. It admits of no degrees. Okay, this is a new claim. And it is impossible that a person should be in part the same and in part different because a person is a monad and is not divisible into parts. The evidence of identity in other persons than ourselves does indeed admit of all degrees, from what we account certainty to the least degree of probability. But still, it is true that the same person is perfectly the same and cannot be so in part or in degree only. Okay, so he's got his idea of identity in general. He's got his reasons for understanding his own personal identity. Then he moves on to the identities of other people. And he says that's a little fuzzier. He doesn't think it's wrong, of course, but he's saying the evidence I have for that is not immediately what I remember. Like that's an exact immediate evidence. Oh, there's a dude. He was alive 20 years ago and I have his memories. So there's this guy called myself that exists. So I don't actually have that for other people. I have other evidence and he might look at some in a moment, but that evidence is somewhere between like point 0.1 to 9, right? Point 0.1 to point 0.9. It's somewhere like between 10 and 90% likely. Maybe it's even like maybe there's some times where I have very, very, very little evidence or really, really strong evidence, but it's never as certain a thing as what I proved a moment ago, he says. Okay. For this cause, I have first considered personal identity as that which is perfect in its kind and the natural measure of that which is imperfect. And then he makes this other point. Just because there's degrees of evidence for something doesn't mean that the thing we're talking about has degrees, right? So he's saying there's degrees of evidence that other people, to me, that other people have the same kind of a self that I know I have, something unbroken, consistent through time. That evidence might not be a full 100% for me. Let's see. We'll see what arguments we can come up with, what evidence we can find. But don't mistake that for meaning I think that the person is 90% a person or 10% a person. The only way you can have a self, as we've examined earlier, is something that is simple and not dividable into parts. So if I'm 99% sure that somebody has an identity other than myself, then I am 99% sure that they have a complete, simple identity that isn't broken. They have a full one. And if I'm 1% sure that they do, then I'm 1% sure that they have a complete, full, simple identity. Right? That's the only way you can be an identity. Okay. We probably at first derive our notion of identity from that natural conviction which every man has from the dawn of reason of his own identity and continued existence. The operations of our minds are all successive and have no continued existence, but the thinking being has a continued existence. And we have an invincible belief. He says, you couldn't even possibly not believe what I'm saying, that you remain the same when all of your thoughts and operations have changed. Our judgments of the identity of objects of sense seem to be formed upon much the same grounds as our judgments of the identity of other persons than ourselves. Wherever we observe great similarity, we are apt to presume identity. If no reason appears to the contrary, two objects ever so like, when they are perceived at the same time, cannot be the same. But if they are presented to our senses at different times, we are apt to think them the same, merely from their similarity. You see how he can get to all of the same observations as David Hume from the exact opposite starting point. Okay. Whether this be a natural prejudice or from whatever cause it proceeds, it certainly appears in children from infancy. And when we grow up, it is confirmed in most instances by experience, for we rarely find two individuals of the same species that are not distinguishable by obvious differences. A man challenges a thief whom he finds in possession of his horse or his watch only on similarity. When the watchmaker swears that he sold this watch to a person, his testimony is grounded on similarity. The testimony of witnesses to the identity of a person is commonly grounded on no other evidence. So I like this paragraph a lot because the weaknesses that I think you pointed out in the David Hume, he has said, I see weaknesses here. I think they really do boil down to this thing that Socrates somehow had figured out about you. If everything you've ever experienced is variable and changing, you shouldn't have a notion of similarity, let alone sameness, because you would need the notion of sameness in order to have the notion of similarity, right? So I think David Hume came up against that and kind of saw that there was a problem with his thinking because of that. But Reed is pointing that out. He's saying because all of our perceptions and all of our experiences are different, yet somehow we still identify these are very similar. They're in the same category. There's a sameness to this. Well, okay. I it's very easy to imagine that we would say, "Oh, well, I can see these things are similar. I'll put them in this category. These things are similar. I'll put them in that category." And then I'll just make the name of sameness. It's like, "No, no, 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 no. You can't have the notion of similarity without the actual idea of sameness." But nothing is perfectly sameness. You've never experienced that unless, of course, you have. Unless you're experiencing something about yourself that has that quality, right? This is I mean, it's beautiful. We did Socrates a couple of times already, and I can't wait till we go back into him again. But he had all of this spelled out. It's really actually kind of astonishing how many millennia we spend writing and thinking and arguing various aspects of. Now, I'm not saying that the idea is correct necessarily when I say he had it all spelled out. I just mean he saw that clearly and thought that was correct. And here we are still trying to unravel or explore the consequences or see the same truth as the light shines on different nooks and crannies of ideas here. Okay. We don't have to talk about the side note of witness testimony and how unreliable it is, nor memory and how unreliable it is. If it's possible to have a memory, if it's possible that somebody could recognize a friend, then his argument still holds, right? So we don't have to worry about that side conversation. Okay. Thus, it appears that the evidence we have of our own identity, as far back as we remember, is totally of a different kind from the evidence we have of the identity of other persons. Totally different evidence, or of objects of sense, things that we perceive. The first is grounded on memory and gives undoubted certainty. The last is grounded on similarity and on other circumstances, which in many cases are not so decisive as to leave no room for doubt. It may likewise be observed that the identity of objects of sense is never perfect. All bodies, as they consist of innumerable parts that may be disjoined from them by a great variety of causes, are subject to continual changes of their own substance, increasing, diminishing, changing insensibly. When such alterations are gradual, because language could not afford a different name for every different state of such a changeable thing, it retains the same name and is considered as the same thing. Thus, we say of an old regiment that it did such a thing a century ago, right? The army we're talking about did something a century ago, though there now is not a man alive who had then belonged to it. We say a tree is the same as the seed bed, and in the forest is the same in the seed bed and in the forest. A ship of war, which has successively changed her anchors, her tackle, her sails, her masts, her planks, and her timbers, while she keeps the same name, is the same. The identity, therefore, which, all right, so let's pause. So David Hume is going to massively emphasize how different and different and different things are and say we have an illusion of sameness. We're just making it up. I keep investigating and all I find is difference everywhere I look. I heard I heard Sam Harris bring up this other topic. Said, "Do you know that you don't weigh anything?" Or there's not a specific number that you weigh, right? Like if I were to answer the question, or there is, but it's impossible to answer the question what I weigh because every moment I weigh something different than I weighed before because I'm breathing out molecules and it's like I'm just changing weight constantly. Everything is actually like that, and yet we say that they're the same. And he says because of the use of language, Socrates thought there's something really profound here. We shouldn't be able to notice sameness at all except that we have access to something infinite or you know unlimited or simple or the very nature of the type of thing he's looking at here. Okay, so David Hume says it's all different, it's different, it's different. It's like, but there's a sameness, right? David Hume says, well, the sameness must be an illusion. All I can do is collect evidence of differences. It's like, yeah, but if you could do the rationalist experiment on this, and he did do it, right? David Hume said, I looked inside my mind and I didn't find a thing that I could perceive, right? But maybe there's something about the rationalist project that isn't just looking at the ideas that you're perceiving, but it's noticing, experiencing, finding the thing that's unbroken. By the way, this is the thought process that Descartes was using, and he had told his friend, uh, the whole point of my philosophy isn't to prove that we exist, to prove that there is a world, that 2 plus 3 make 5. Like nobody sane could ever doubt those things. The point of my philosophy was to show we know that we exist and that God exists before we know anything else. You can't know those other things unless you know those things first. They're primary, they're basic, they're fundamental, and you have more immediate access to them than to anything else. And so far he's pointing Reed is making that same move, following that same path, treading it down and wearing it down just a little bit, making it a little bit clearer perhaps, but he's doing it just with the self part for now. Okay, so let's see here. When such alterations are gradual, la-di-da-di-da. The identity, therefore, which we ascribe to bodies, to things, objects, right? Whether natural or artificial, is not perfect identity. It is rather something which, for the convenience of speech, we call identity. It admits of a great change of the subject, providing the change be gradual, sometimes even of a total change. And the changes which are common, which in common language are made consistent with identity, differ from those that are thought to destroy it, not in kind, but in number and degree. It has no fixed nature when applied to bodies, and questions about the identity of a body are very often questions about words. But identity, when applied to persons, has no ambiguity and admits not of degrees or of more or less. It is the foundation of all rights and obligations and of all accountableness, and the notion of it is fixed and precise. All right, let's pause for a minute. Let's put on our David Hume hat and say, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. You just said that there's nothing about a simple unchangedness about the object that you call the same, right? I pointed out that was an illusion. You're calling it the same, but it's changing all the time. You have no right to call it the same. Everything is changing and varied. And then you admitted that that is actually the nature of the thing. We're still calling it a thing, but it's not actually true of things. And then you're saying, but it is true of personalities. Well, now, wait a minute. If you can have the illusion that it's true of an object outside yourself, why is it not an illusion that it's true of your self or of other people's selves, of other personalities? Right? He might say that. It's important to notice, I think, that Reed's argument is not based on the idea that because I perceive it this way, it has to be true, right? His idea is not because everybody assumes that it's the same object so long as it doesn't change too much or too quickly or whatever, that means it is actually a same thing. Unless, right? So that wasn't his argument for why we are an unchanging thing either. He says, notice that you think of yourself that way. But the idea is you can't possibly think of yourself that way or of anything else that way unless there is something like that in the universe. Now, maybe that's a part of that maybe this is an enthymeme and I'm making too much of this. So let's say we're putting on the Socratic hat right now and saying Socrates' whole point to dissolve this question, maybe Reed doesn't quite see this, although I think it was strongly hinted at in a couple of lines, is that the ability to even conceptualize of something being like that means there has to be something like that and you have access to it. If it might not be true, therefore, of yourself, other selves, or objects. Maybe there's some other thing, maybe some the simple oneness thing that happens to be and has a stamp of itself on us to give us the notion, but we would need something to be like that for us to have the notion in the first place. That's Descartes' argument. And then on top of that, Reed says, "Oh, and I have memories. I remember what I did 2 summers ago, so everything about my circumstances changed, everything about, 7 years ago, 20 years ago, all the molecules have changed, everything's different, right? All the cells have died and other cells have taken their place, but I have a memory, so there's something like that about me." But he has that added evidence as proof. The original Socratic idea, well, the Cartesian idea in the third meditation is there must be something like that, right? Then we can discover if it's true of ourselves and true of other people and true of objects. But there has to be something like that. And this was Socrates' argument with he was looking exactly at sameness and the notion of sameness and the fact that we can even use such a notion to say, look, if everything is chaotic ocean, you shouldn't what did you bump into in the chaotic ocean that told you it was possible for something to be the same? You've bumped into nothing like that. So therefore the chaotic ocean ain't just a chaotic ocean. There's some order to it, there's some structure, there's some tides, there's a logos, there's another ingredient involved in this thing. It's not just the chaotic potential. There's the great, as Elena was pointing out, where we have to get to, I think, if we pursue this too long, is there's the great I am. There's the other part of being that has to be a part of it, that you directly experience and recognize has there's a spark of it in yourself. That's all other types of language for describing, but these are exactly the arguments that are being made here, right? So I'm using very, very different language, but to describe what I see are the moves that he's making as he's making them. And I think that doesn't mean he doesn't see it that way, or that he does, right? It doesn't mean that he would agree or disagree or even thought of it in those terms. But I think what's motivating his investigation and what it is that he's seeing there clearly, not just because I like the conclusion or I see that it goes along with it, but because the way the arguments are being made are evidence that he's talking about that thing that Socrates was trying to get at, that arche, that source of all truth being goodness, justice, and love. He's talking about something that requires, now again, he's not talking about the arche in this essay, right? By the way, I'm not trying to reread what he's talking about a personal self. That's what he's concerned with. But when he's looking for something unchanging, something infinite, something, well, maybe not infinite because you can be born and die, but something that even though every aspect of it changes, it doesn't die and then start again. He's looking at the same qualities of something that, Socrates was saying, well, he's saying something beyond that. He's saying there's the absolute version of this, but how do I know? Because I have a little piece of it, basically. And all Reed is doing is saying, look, there's a piece of you that's like that, right? He's not doing that other part. But the reason why I bring that up is that he's using the exact same arguments and observing the exact same things that Socrates was doing when he immediately made that move. Okay. I don't want to keep rambling. I think that's clear enough. I finally got to a point where the words I was using were clear enough. All right, here we go. Let's take a short break. Oh no, let's pause. Do you have something to say, by the way? Oh, just so you know, we're gonna do this like the other class. Interrupt at any time, right? Don't wait for me to pause and ask you. Please feel free to interrupt. Is
Okay,
Go
before
ahead.
we go to the next part of the essay, there was a question that formed, and because I wonder if we are to create a quote unquote definition of what is of identity of a person, what if a person changes the 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 point of action? And I mean this: we can be centered to ourselves, to our system of beliefs, to whatever we hold as identity, to our feelings, emotions, or our struggle towards them, against them, to be a conscious self towards virtues and stepping away from his vices, you know? So, on one hand, we
Or we
can
could do
be,
the opposite.
what do you mean?
Well, right, we could do what you said. We could do the opposite, and we could change in that aspect. Isn't that what you're bringing up?
Partly,
Did I
because
misunderstand you? Maybe I misunderstood you.
partly,
All right,
that
say say
is
say it again, if
that
you don't
is a
mind.
way, yeah, of course, no problem. There is a way of being which is self-centered. In other terms, it is like acting from and within our lower chakras, our lower spirals of energy. But there is another way of being which is soul centered. Of course, it requires for a person or for the human being to be on a higher level of consciousness, whether it is of his own, raising self raising self-acknowledgement, raising self-awareness, and gradually raising self-consciousness, or just be born or with through other trails and paths, raise his consciousness to such a level that as a result of that he acknowledges his soul and the more intelligible facet of his being, and by being I mean the entity that he actually is. So my question is this: we have from at the point A in time, we have a person that acts and is
Yeah.
from sourcing from self-centered.
Yep.
But there is another point which is point B, where that person can act from the soul center.
Yep.
Now, is that a person of the same identity?
That's
The,
what I that's
the,
what I thought that's what I thought you were saying at the beginning. That's what I meant by you could do the one or you could do the opposite and you can change, right?
and
Perfect. I understand.
in between, from the way that I understand things right now, in between there is a whole spectrum of consciousness. It could be the prairie between the two fields,
Okay,
being
but well, wait, we
self-centered
have
and
to answer the
soul-centered.
question first. I know where you're going with that, and I want you to go there. But first, this is a really good question. This is a really, really good question. And I want you to, I want to focus on it, and I want you to focus on it for a second, because let me restate it, prove that I got it. And then let's just focus on that before we go and further, and then we'll go further after. Okay. And one of the reasons I want to focus on it is it's directly related to everything that you're doing in your research project, which we won't talk about here on the recorded session, but everything that you're concerned with, right? So, what you say is person A is the same as person B because person B remembers something when he was A, we whatever. We've got evidence, we understand it's the same person. But person A or person at time A, let's say, is acting selfishly and not oriented towards the good and maybe trying to make things worse, like really not a good person. But later in life, at time B, that same person has repented, has turned around, has untied the knots in his soul, has oriented himself in a different direction towards the good. So, person at time A and person at time B seem to be very different. That's what you're suggesting so far. Yes. And then,
May I add a tiny parenthesis, because this goes to two trails. The way that you explain it is that we have the same person. Point A is all vices. Point
right.
B is all virtues.
But then the question is it really the same person, therefore?
I would answer it is, but the person, whether it was conscious or not, the personality changed because the alignment of the self changed.
So there seem to be two different options here. This is interesting because I thought of the first one, and then when you just said that, I thought of the second one. Okay. There seem to be two different options here, at least two, two that have occurred to me so far. One is it's the same person. And what Reed is looking for is the unchanging thing that makes it the same. And that means that your orientation towards the good or towards the bad is one of the things that can change, just like your thoughts and your perceptions, whether you had pain on one day or you ate an egg on another day or whatever the heck it is that you're perceiving and doing, those things are all changing. So they're not the you we're talking about. So maybe your orientation towards the good is the same person and that part can change. So that means that your orientation and your relationship to the virtue or vice, as you put it, is not a part of the thing that is you. It's a quality of you, right? It's just what you're pointed towards or something like that, perhaps.
Yes, because in the in the previous page of the essay that I have, uh, he he wrote that blah 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 identity differ from those that are thought to destroy it, not in kind but in number and degree. And that number and degree, I also see qualities and percentages.
Right. Okay. Okay. Now you're brought up a third one. You're killing me. You're doing too. I'm having trouble keeping up. You're making too many good points. Okay. So then you say, okay, well, wait a minute. The mound of sand, we keep dumping more sand on it. We dump a dump truck of sand on it. We don't say it's the same mound anymore. It's degree, and it's the amount of time it takes for it to change that make us say if it's the same or not. So now you're saying person A, if that person at time A, if that's 1 minute before time B, something so dramatic has changed that we should just say the person is not the same person they were before, right? But if it's gradual between time A and B, you might say, "Oh, it's the same person. He's been on a journey slowly moving from, pointing in this direction to pointing in a different direction gradually over time." Right? That's the point you just brought up. Yes?
Yes,
Okay.
same person, but a change in between, regardless of level of drama.
Yeah, you
but
keep
but
circling the other alternative, which is really shocking.
but it is the level of drama, the degree of drama, and maybe the quality of the drama. It was so radical that we could, after a percentage, we could say, I don't know, that there was a change of identity. It is a different person. Should only if the that difference was spontaneously, it was pure, it was absolutely authentic, that change was rippled through his entire being, internal,
Sure.
whatever we can verify or not, or
If it's
whatever
that
we could
dramatic a
never.
change. Yeah.
Yes, because that there are such changes, and they are from core of a person to the way, and you can might even see to the way that they greet you.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're talking about. So the folk Christian language for this is called being born again, right? Like a person says, "Look, I was addicted to drugs and I was rude and unkind and impatient and violent with my friends and family and all of this stuff, and then I had a moment, a flash of insight, grace from divine, and suddenly I'm just a different person now." And so they call it being born again if it happens that dramatically. If it happens really gradually, the Christian theological concept might be something more like sanctification. There's a process version of the same thing, but the folk, let's just say the average everyday Christian conception of things, they use a term called being born again, which is what it sounds like you're describing. You're saying this is such a dramatic change, this is such an unbelievable shift all at once that we just, it's like there's a new person. It's like the person's been, made alive and they weren't before or something like that. That's the language even from the myth, but that's like Christ was using that type of language in the scriptures, right? So then that, let's go back to that first question then, which is it the same person if it's gradual or if it's rapid? Either way, is the person at A the same as the person at B? For Reed, it seems like you would have to say, well, of course they're the same person because we know there is an unchanging thing about us, right? Person B remembers what they used to be like, right? That's all the evidence he's basing that off of, that it is the same person in some sense, right? So that means that your orientation, your wisdom, your enlightenment, whatever the heck happened to make that big dramatic change in a single individual, which you're talking about, didn't affect the core of who they were. Now, bear with me here because we're going to get to the thing that you keep pointing at. I promise we're going to get to it. So I I hear you. So from Reed's perspective, it can't be that your orientation, your affinity for vice versus virtue, uh, any of those things, no matter how dramatically they change, that's the use of language that's convenient for us to say. It's like a nice little metaphor in the little m metaphor sense to say born again or radically, received enlightenment in a moment or whatever terminology we want to use. That's just a use of language. But for Reed, no, it has to still be the same person. However, the other alternative that you seem to be bringing up as a possible question is, what about death and resurrection? I don't mean physical, although, who knows about physical. Uh, Nietzsche had this idea that the way of the creator requires, it really requires a death and a rebirth. Christ had said this thing of, if you want to save your life, give it up, sacrifice it. Take up your cross and follow me. Like the way to eternal life is first to die, or something like that. Which of course contradicts everything that Reed thinks is not self-contradictory, right? Reed says it would be self-contradictory to say that something stopped existing and then came into existence later, because that would be to say that it did exist before it came into being, and the language doesn't work. Well, there is something self-contradictory about saying save your life by giving it up. Well, it's as if that language is saying, well, there's a real you behind the other you. That's the thing that is unchanging that we want to preserve, but you have to let go of everything else in order to get there. And it's not just Christ and it's not just Nietzsche who have this idea. Obviously, all of the mythopoetic traditions, I mean, the phoenix, we're just talking about the image of the phoenix. It's like every, I shouldn't say every. I'm not expert enough to say every. Time and again, in the Greek mythology, the Egyptian mythology, the Mesopotamian theology, time and again, time and again, time and again, the people who were trying the hardest to think about what it's like to really be in the world, and then maybe before they could even put it into words, put it into images and sculptures and paintings and stories in narrative language, they all kept getting at the same idea that there's clinging to life, clinging to your identity is a sure way to make sure that it doesn't mm, preserve itself or achieve what it needs to achieve in an eternal or infinite sort of a sense. That embracing the cross, embracing the destruction, allowing yourself to be burnt up so you can rebuild out of the ashes. Again, there's always a contradiction in all of these things, and Reed is trying to be philosophical, and that means we don't want contradictions. But the stories themselves are all contradictory, right? It's like, I burned myself up completely so that I could be rebuilt out of the ashes. It's like, well, then you didn't burn up completely. You rebuilt yourself out of that which does not burn. Okay, well, it's no wonder that that's much more powerful than that which could be burned, right? Anyway, we don't have to get into all the myth. We're not trying to do our fun second and third year stuff that we had done, you and I had done before. But I don't know. I don't know, right? So the question you brought up is A to B, is it the same person? There's certainly a lot of serious thinkers who say, no, you actually have to die and be reborn. But when they say that, it's you that has to die and be reborn. So even in that language, there's still a self that is beyond that. So if that's the case, so either the myth and the mythological language is pointing us at something that is so true that we can't say it without contradiction, which is, of course, dreams are telling us things, but dreams are contradictory all the time in time and space and all of that stuff. So maybe there is a truth that is contradictory. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that Reed actually can understand this. And he's saying, look, whatever we say propositionally, that can't be contradictory. So let's just be clear that there is a self. You remember what you were like before you were saved or before you achieved enlightenment on the Buddhistic path or whatever it was that made this dramatic change in you. And again, maybe it's gradual for some people, but Elena is bringing up the instance of a person who says, look, I was one way and then holy cow, everybody can tell everybody, you say hi to me and it's like, holy cow, there's a different person now. um for the people that we're looking at who have that, who are examples of that experience, um maybe the best we can do philosophically, or maybe the accurate reality, because it's still, again, it's still in the mythological story too, that there is a you that you are saving by giving up and dying. So it what so what Reed is saying is, yeah, when we're talking, let's be clear. There is a you. It has the memory of before that moment of enlightenment, and it's you in point B that remembers what you in point A was like. Um, that proves that there is something unbroken about you, even past that. So I don't know the answer to the question. If there has to be a total death and rebirth, or I don't know. But everything you're saying fits in. I think Reed wouldn't be bothered by any of it, right? Reed is looking for an identity that doesn't stop existing and then start again later. He doesn't want contradictions logically with the words he's using, but um, everything you're talking about, which is awesome to talk about, is only evidence for him from his perspective that what we mean by the real self that I'm trying to talk about is not just what I'm oriented towards, my affinity for vice or virtue, or however, whatever terminology is actually appropriate, or whichever one we want to use for this type of a change in a person. If it can change in you, like your perceptions or your thoughts or your orientations or your affinity for goodness or whatever, if it can change, it's not the self we're talking about. The self is the thing that maybe decides, hey, I need to change or something like that. But the change, if it's changeable, it's not the thing he's identified as. Obviously, it can't be broken. Does that make sense? If we go back to just trying to understand exactly what Reed is saying, not to say that that has to be the case.
No, absolutely. And I totally resonate with him if I elevate a bit. I mean, I need to, as to totally resonate with him, I need to not use the word, the term self, but use the I am. This is perpetually there. It is the I, it is the entity. And depending on level of consciousness, because there can be dramatic changes, it is the same I am, but depending on the level of consciousness, self-consciousness, or whatever else of kinds, there is a different identity. You identify differently when you know you are an entity and you are aware of your soul, of yourself as a soul, as an entity, and you are aware of your core, of your center, and of your essences. There is a different kind of identity than of a self. And then
Okay.
you have an entirely different self structure around that, because it is equivalent to having an illness, an autoimmune, let's say, that you must change your lifestyle because of it. But with level of consciousness, it is on the positive, it's towards the light.
I understand. Okay, I am really excited because it only took us into the second essay. Maybe we even got into it in the first for what I was hoping was going to happen when you and I do the full philosophy of mind course, which is starting already with this 101 stuff, which is I have a ton of questions to ask you about your anatomy of the self, your research that you're doing. And all of this is helpful for understanding how it is that you're able to dissect the self, and we can see the tools that Reed is using. So I'm not going to ask any of that right now. We're going to finish this essay, then we're going to cut the video and we're going to go into our after conversation. And I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions because I'm super excited to understand the way you're thinking about this. And that move that you just described making makes perfect sense, right? You're using to talk about the self, right? Maybe we can't fully wrap around. But if we're going to engage in trying to write and think and talk about the anatomy of the self, these are the types of tools available to us, and you're utilizing them. So I don't want to get into it right now because let's go do that after we're done with this essay so that it's not part of the recorded thing. But I'm super excited, and I thank you for saying what you said. Okay, so we only have two short sections left to read here. Interrupt me, and if you don't, I'm probably going to just try to burst through this here. Thought requires a thinker. Okay, remember, he asserted that earlier. Now he's going to actually back it up. The thoughts of which I am conscious are the thoughts of a being which I call myself, my mind, my person. The thoughts and feelings of which we are conscious are continually changing, and the thought of this moment is not the thought of the last, but something which I call myself remains under this change of thought. This self has the same relation to all the successive thoughts I am conscious of. They are all my thoughts, and every thought which is not my thought must be the thought of some other person. If any man asks a proof of this, I confess I can give none. There is an evidence in the proposition itself which I am unable to resist. Shall I think that thought? Shall I think that thought can stand by itself without a thinking being, or that ideas can feel pleasure and or pain? My nature dictates to me that it is impossible, and that nature has dictated the same to all men, and that nature has dictated the same to all men appears in the structure of all languages. For in all languages, men have expressed thinking, reasoning, willing, loving, hating by personal verbs, which from their nature require a person who thinks, reasons, wills, loves, or hates. From which it appears that men have been taught by nature to believe that thought requires a thinker, reason, a reasoner, and love, a lover. All right, we're gonna have to pause. I can this is a great essay because when we get into the philosophy of mind course that this is the intro to, we're going to talk about something again. He just barely in half a line of his argument is referring to. We're going to read entire essays on one part of one thing that he said here. I'm going to reread what it was he said. Shall I think that thought can stand by itself without a thinking being? Okay, let's put that aside. Or that ideas can feel pleasure or pain? That's the one. All right. If all there is to me are the perceptions, which are mental thoughts, if that's all there is to me, how is it that I feel pleasure and pain? Right? Can one of my thought things that's not really mine, it's just the thing occurring, as David Hume was saying, possess another one of the things occurring? That he says, I don't know. I don't know if I even have an argument. All I know is there's something about being me. My nature dictates to me that that's not possible. Okay, let's focus on that. He's not saying I can't imagine it because he's obviously read David Hume. He's obviously looked at people who are saying, look, thinking occurs. That doesn't mean there's a doer behind the deed. And Nietzsche said that was just an convenience of language. Right? He's pointing out that it's a universal of language. It's a universal of language that we posit a doer behind the deeds. And then he says, well, how did that happen? Wouldn't you just have an accidental language, at least one emerge where that's not the way people think about things? It turns out it's not thinkable. And it's almost been hardwired into us to understand this. It's little bits of evidence, right? Might not be fully convincing just that alone. But what he's actually basing this argument on of pleasure and pain is called the qualia argument. So if all you do is register the fact that a pain has occurred or a pleasure has occurred, you're David Hume. You're just recording that these things have happened. But if you can ask the question of yourself, how is it possible that a happening can have another happening? It just like my language just says, I'm the one feeling the pain. I'm the one feeling the pleasure. That's pretty simple and straightforward. But is it even thinkable? Is it even thinkable that it's just a series of things happening? And the evidence of that is the quality of the pain. All right. The quality of the pleasure. That's not so we won't totally get into this, but I think that that's inherent in this thing that he's saying here. His second one only, that ideas could feel that ideas can feel pleasure or pain. It's like something to feel pain. It's like something to feel pleasure. And we won't go off and make a whole qualia argument now, but he's actually, I think the germ of that argument it's being relied upon in this paragraph, only in that one tiny little half of a phrase. But the idea that it's like something to feel pain and it's like something to feel pleasure, that it's like has to be to a thing that it can be like. It can be like something to be that thing. Um, the just merely descriptive, the merely um, uh, formulaic, the mere account of the data that comes in of this thought was being thought between 3:32 and 3:35 a.m. on this date, and then at 3:35 a.m. this thought was being thought. Right, that's David Hume. He's just collecting all of the thoughts, and he's just saying that's all I have access to is just that stuff. But Reed is saying, now wait a minute, hold on. Some of those perceptions have a quality to them. They're the kind of thing that have to happen to somebody, right? David Hume is saying all I have access to are the things that are happening, so I deny that there's a someone to whom they're happening to. Uh, but that might even work if all of what you are is just thoughts. But there's a way in which it might not work that way. But there's a way in which it doesn't work for perceiving red, for seeing green. It's like something to see green. If your existence, and it might be this way, and it might have been this way for David Hume, if your existence is when I see green, I'm a Terminator, and through the camera, what happens is wavelengths between 352 and 376 nanometers of radiation strike it, and then it registered to me 339 nanometer wavelength. I don't see green like the quality of greenness. I just notice that that message has been sent to me and I'm registering that message. If it's not like anything but that, then maybe David Hume is correct. But then with Reed, and this is what's so interesting about some of these questions, is that it's almost like the scientists and the empiricists, they want something so solid that we have peer review confirmation from running the same experiment, being very careful that we're running it again. But what's interesting about this is that each individual has to run the experiment. Each person has to say to themselves, is it like something for me to see green? Or do I just get the message that that type of stuff is happening? The same type of stuff that hits my eye when I look at the green book is the same type of stuff that's hitting my eye when I look at the grass, but it's not like anything. Right. And it might not be like anything for David Hume, perhaps. He says, look, you could have a different life than I have. I don't see any evidence. And maybe it was like something for David Hume, but he just didn't realize the consequence of that. But Reed is saying, no, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait. Pleasure and pain are the kinds of things that can't just come in a succession of things. They'd have to apply what to the first thing that happened right before them? That doesn't make any sense. I remember the pain and what it was like. What it was like is in my memory. And so it's like something. And that can't just be a thing disconnected from, I mean, it is disconnected from all the other things that are happening. So there must be a self. There must be a self that it's happening to. All right, we won't look. He literally could have written the entire essay just on that, and instead he's got a lot of really powerful arguments that he throws in these like qualified parts of a sentence. But that is his argument. I mean, his argument does in part rely on that, I think. Okay. And then he makes the second argument that look, if you're wondering if it's like that for us people, you crazy Martian David Hume who doesn't seem to notice this, if you're wondering if it's anything like that, notice the universal of human language. All human language developed to just presume that there was a doer behind the deed or a perceiver that the thing was happening to or whatever. And why would that happen accidentally? Right? These different languages, they evolved in different cultures and at different times and on different continents. And you think it's just accidental? It's like, no, that's some good evidence that even if it's not true for you, you could run the experiment yourself and say, is pain the sort of thing that could have happened to the idea that came right before it or right after it? Or is it the sort of thing that has to come to a person that can have the quality of what it's like be registered? Um, that might not even be the best way of saying it. Is it coming to a, or let's just say, is it the sort of thing that has to happen to an entity? Let's just leave it at just that. So if you ran that experiment and you came up with the opposite conclusion, what David Hume affirms or asserts that he didn't talk about the quality of question in this way necessarily, but what he's saying is, um, I don't have any I look inside my mind and I don't perceive myself. And then he limits himself to saying the only things I can talk about as knowledge are things that come through perceptions. So maybe he did that experiment. And he said, "Oh yeah, of course it's like something to be me, but I'm going to be a clever son of a bitch and prove that we can't prove it in this way." And then say, "Oh, there's a crisis of empiricism or something." Who knows? But maybe he did the experiment and he was like the Terminator. He's just like the robot that I know the wavelength is hitting me and I can register that, but it's not like anything to see green. And if that is the case, then Reed says, well, look, okay, maybe it's true of you, but look at human language. We all evolved and we all evolved to speak about things in this way. And none of us thought about it ahead of time, like, ooh, let's craft our language to trick future philosophers into thinking that this is how it has to be. It's just the only way we had for describing things. So that's some evidence that it's true of all the people around you. It's true of most of them, or it's true of what people used to be like when they were inventing the languages, or it's true of anybody who can understand poetry. I mean, uh, look, obviously he thinks it's true of everybody, but he's looking for evidence to back it up. So he makes that second argument. Okay, let's move on. Sorry. Here we must leave Mr. Hume. Okay, so he's obviously been thinking about Hume the entire time, and he says so. Here we must leave Mr. Hume, who conceives it to be a vulgar error that besides the thoughts we are conscious of, there is a mind which is the subject of those thoughts. If the mind be anything else than impressions and ideas, it must be a word without a meaning. The mind, therefore, according to this philosopher, is a word which signifies a bundle of perceptions, or when he defines it more accurately, quote, it is that succession of related ideas and impressions of which we have an intimate memory and consciousness, unquote. I am, therefore, that succession of related ideas and impressions of which I have an intimate memory and consciousness. But who is the I that has this memory and consciousness of a succession of ideas and impressions? Why, it is nothing but that succession itself. Hence, I learn that this succession of ideas and impressions intimately remembers and is conscious of itself, right? It all boils back down to that rationalist experiment and what you discover when you do it. I would wish to be further instructed. All right, so he's putting David Hume's words out there. He's saying, "Oh, okay, I see. So I'm nothing but a bundle of perceptions." Okay, and when I consider what that is that had the perceptions, it's the bundle itself. Okay, And the bundle is there because it intimately remembers all of those perceptions. Okay. And that's all I am, huh? Hence, I learn that this succession of ideas and impressions intimately remembers and is conscious of itself. I would wish to be further instructed whether the impressions remember and are conscious of the ideas, or the ideas remember and are conscious of the impressions, or if both remember and are conscious of both, and whether the ideas remember those that come after them as well as those that were before them. These are questions naturally arising from this system that have not yet been explained, right? So he's saying, okay, let's pretend you're right. Let's take your idea. I'm a knot tied around a whole bunch of perceptions. And I'm aware of that. That's how I can know how I had the illusion that I was a thing besides that. Okay. So is it my thoughts or my perceptions that are perceiving my thoughts or my perceptions? And is it the whole group of them that perceives the ones that came before? Do they also perceive the ones that come after? Would you answer any of these questions? Because none of that seems like it's workable at all, he says. Okay. This, however, is clear that this succession of ideas and impressions not only remembers and is conscious, but that it judges, reasons, affirms, denies, nay, that it eats and drinks and is sometimes merry and sometimes sad. If these things can be ascribed to a succession of ideas and impressions in a consistency with common sense, I should be very glad to know what is nonsense. Right. So he doesn't think he needs to do any more than just say, I'm gonna say clearly what it was David Hume was saying, and I'm gonna say, "If that's not nonsense, I'd like to know what is." Okay. But the real insight for us is that this is all reliant upon exactly what David Hume thought it was all reliant upon, which is the willingness of to do that internal experiment, and then what you find when you do it. Right? David Hume isn't just babbling nonsense. He's saying, I did the experiment. All I find are perceptions and nothing else. Maybe that's true. Maybe he just refuses to see things that aren't coming at him from the senses. And so he denies them and says, well, I'll put that in the category of it must be an illusion and I'll figure out how later. Who knows? But he is doing the experiment and and it all hinges on that experiment. Is it like something for me to be in the world? If it is, there's consequences. And if it's not, maybe I'm just this Cartesian robot. Maybe I'm just this there's no real me. Okay. Last paragraph. The scholastic philosophers have been wittily ridiculed by representing them as disputing upon this question. Num chimera bombinans in vacuo or vacuo posit comedere secundas intentiones. Oh, it's part of a passage from Gargantua and Pantagruel. I think I have that here somewhere. In which Rabelais is poking fun at the choice books of the library of Saint Victor, one of which we are told is entitled Quatio Subtilissimus. You're gonna have to forgive me for not being able to read Greek and Latin well. Utrum chimera in vacuo bombinans, right? The babies, the children, I guess. Posit comedere secundus intentiones et fuit debatuata per decum hebdom hebdomadas in concilio. Okay, I'm not going to read the last word. All right, so let's see if we can do. And from that is made. I don't know. Let's see. Is he going to give us the damn translation? Okay. Father Alan B. Walter of the Catholic University of America, to whom I am indebted for this information, has suggested the following idiomatic translation. On the most subtle question, could a creature of fantasy buzzing in a perfect vacuum feed upon ideas of idea? Okay. The title of the book is Could a Creature of Fantasy, Buzzing in a Perfect Vacuum, Feed Upon Ideas of Ideas, debated over a period of 10 weeks by the Council of Constance? Okay, that's really funny. So Gargantua and Pantagruel is Rabelais' book. It's in that category. We shouldn't categorize these types of things, but it's social and political satire. and criticism. And so in the library of St. Vicar, there's a book, and the title of the book is a collection, the book is a collection of debates had over 10 weeks by the Council of Constance on the question of, is it possible for a creature of fantasy living in a perfect vacuum to feed upon ideas of ideas? Okay, that's hilarious, by the way. It's like anyway, everybody knows what it's like. It's like I hate getting old and forgetting words. Gulliver's Travels. It's in the category of Voltaire's works. It's social and political satire, and often has a lot of philosophy in it. Okay, so now that he's told us that, let's get back to his point here. Um, the scholastic philosopher. Okay, so the scholastic philosophers, we know who they are. Well, we will in year two, but the scholastic philosophers, these medieval lovers of Aristotle, have been wittily ridiculed by representing them as disputing upon this question. Right? You're thinking about these. It's like you're gazing into your belly button. I think it was a German phrase, maybe it was a French phrase. It translates to if you ask somebody what they're doing and they're just sort of staring blankly into space, or if you're staring blankly into space and somebody asks you what you're doing, a fun response is it translates into English as I was contemplating the immortality of the soul of the crab. Right? So if I wasn't thinking about anything I can report to you right now, just something was happening in my brain. Whatever. Anyway, it's fun. So he says we used to we do ridicule these philosophers for thinking about these types of things. I believe the wit of man cannot invent a more ridiculous question. But if Mr. Hume's philosophy be admitted, this question deserves to be treated more gravely. For if, as we learn from this philosophy, a succession of ideas and impressions may eat and drink and be merry, I see no good reason why a chimera, if not the same, is of kin to an idea may not chew the cud upon that kind of food which the schoolmen call second intentions. Ideas of ideas. Wow, that's all right. So this is a beautiful paragraph, and I should have read it better. But he's already gone to the point of saying, look, here's David Hume's idea. I'll just say it plainly. If that's not nonsense, I don't know what is. And then he goes further, uh, flowering. It's beautiful. And he says, let's try again without the Latin. The scholastic philosophers have been wittily ridiculed by representing them as disputing upon this question whether or not it's possible for baby chimeras in a vacuum to feed upon second intentions. Okay. Uh, I like this other translation, more direct. Uh, on the most subtle question, could a creature of fantasy buzzing in a perfect vacuum feed upon the ideas of ideas? Okay. But if Mr. Hume's philosophy be admitted, this question deserves to be treated more gravely. If Hume is right, we should start wondering whether or not fantastic creatures living in a vacuum could feed off of the ideas of ideas. Because apparently, all I am is the knot tied around a whole bunch of perceptions and nothing else. So that sounds like a chimeric fantasy, and it apparently is living off of. It's feeling pain and joy, which are just other perceptions and ideas. So, hey, maybe we should. So, anyway, he says this is nonsense, and then he says it reminds me of this really funny uh, satirical work. All right, let's pause for a minute. I've written some questions for you based on your subject of research and the dissection of the self. And we'll get into that conversation when we end our class today, which is going to happen soon. I know we've had a lot to talk about, and maybe that's because of your interest in this subject and the fact that it's so relevant and helpful. But I'm really loving going through this, and I also don't want to make it take too long by not finishing this essay today. So bear with me. One more big burst. Oh, do you have anything to say about what we just read? It was funny, right?
It was, and no, I have nothing to say.
All right, we'll talk.
Let's just move on.
Yeah, all right. We'll talk after. All right, good. Some strange consequences of Locke's account of personal identity. Mr. Locke tells us that personal identity, that is, the sameness of a rational being, consists in consciousness alone, and as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person, so that whatever has the consciousness of present and past actions is the same person to whom they belong, unquote. This doctrine has some strange consequences. Notice that sounds similar to what he's saying, but it's not what he's saying, right? He wants to make it clear. I'm not saying that. So he's going to attack that idea. This doctrine has some strange. So his idea is memory is enough evidence for me to know that I'm the same thing, even though everything else has changed. What Mr. Locke is saying is whatever you can remember, that's who you are, right? So you're not really the person that things happen to that you don't remember, right? The identity of yourself is the collection of all your memories and your consciousness and all of that, and that alone. He's not saying that. He's saying, no, you were the baby that sucked at your mother's breast. You didn't remember that. You're also the person in sixth grade who got an A on a test that you didn't expect to, and you don't remember that. You're also the person in seventh grade who completely remembers getting beaten up in the playground or beating somebody up in the playground. So you're still the same person. The fact that you can have a memory from when you were 7 or in 7th grade is enough for you to know that there's a distinct sameness of a self apart from all these things that are happening. Locke's idea is different. He's saying you are, what makes you up and what you are right now, plus all of your memories and whatever you're conscious of, and that's it. So you're just the things you remember, but not the things you don't remember. Okay. So he says this doctrine has some strange consequences, which the author was aware of. One, that if the same consciousness can be transferred from one intelligent being to another, which he thinks he cannot show to be impossible, then 2 or 20 intelligent beings may be the same person. He identified that. We're going to talk a lot about this when we get into the AI section and the personal identity section. We're going to talk more about this in the future if it sounds interesting. All right, what if I could download my brain and then put it in another person, but also keep a copy myself? Now there's two me's because it's the same consciousness with all the same memories. And he says, I don't see why that should be impossible, but that's a weird consequence of my theory. And then he says of Locke, who was saying this of his own theory, if intelligent being may lose the consciousness of the actions done by them, which surely is possible, then he is not the person who did those actions. So that one intelligent being may be 2 or 20 different persons if he shall so often lose the consciousness of his former actions. 3, there is another consequence of this doctrine, which follows no less necessarily. Now, this is really cool. Though, all right, so this is going to be worth looking at. So we've seen a lot of really cool intellectual and philosophical tools and tricks and maneuvers that Reed has made, and it's clear that some of them are quite applicable to your study of trying to dissect and give the anatomy of the self, which is what we'll talk about in just a moment when we end the stream on this. Let's notice him doing a couple of them at the same time right now. He's looking at the logical consequences of the definition. He's going to see if they lead to an absurdity. He's going to use the law of non-contradiction. If they lead to a non-contradictory or to a self-contradictory conclusion, then the idea must be wrong, according to the philosopher, right? If I say A and A means B, but B, or let's say if I say proposition P, like all A is B or something like that, and that entails some other proposition Q which contradicts itself and entails not Q, then clearly A must be wrong. That first proposition of mine can't be true if it means that some other proposition has to be true, which is also a contradiction. Then he's going to do a little thought experiment. Let's see him do it. It's a cool way of arguing. He says, here's another contradiction Locke didn't point out. Maybe he didn't see it. And it's this: a man may be, and at the same time not be, the person that did a particular action. Here's how. Suppose a brave officer to have been flogged when a boy at school for robbing an orchard, and to have taken a standard from the enemy in his first campaign, and to have been made a general in advanced life. Suppose also, which must be admitted to be possible, that when he took the standard, he was conscious of having been flogged at school, and that when he was made a general, he was conscious of his having taken the standard in his first campaign, but had absolutely lost the consciousness of his flogging as a child. These things being supposed, it follows from Mr. Locke's doctrine that he who was flogged at school is the same person who took the standard, and that he who took the standard is the same person who was made a general. Whence it follows, if there be any truth in logic, that the general is the same person with him who was flogged at school. But the general's consciousness does not reach so far back as his flogging. Therefore, according to Mr. Locke's doctrine, he is not the person who was flogged. Therefore, the general is, and at the same time is not, the same person with him who was flogged at school. Okay, we won't go into a big long side talk about Locke. I think we actually looked at, or we're going to look at some of his at some point, maybe in this backbone course. That was a cool. It's cool to look at the way he reasons, and I want to talk more about that. And what we're going to do is rapidly end this right now, so that you and I can have an after conversation where we talk about your research and also the techniques and the methods of philosophy that were put on display for us right now, where we can start to get familiar with them and see the moves that are made and how they're made and which ones are argued as illegitimate and which ones are legitimate and which ones are convincing to us. I mean, the law of non-contradiction can be argued against in the sense that philosophers can argue everything. They very, very rarely ever argue against the law of non-contradiction. They very, very not. It's probably more common to have David Hume's idea that you don't exist and only the shadows exist. That might be more common than somebody arguing that the law of non-contradiction is an error and we shouldn't keep it. But it is possible. Philosophers argue everything. However, with Reid, we got to see we got to see him talk about this subject. That is the reason, I think, the main reason why you're here for this class. And so I'm really excited about that. But also, a lot of the maneuvers he made are worth studying and worth rereading, and it might be worth studying him more, to see the way he talks about it in the context of people who are saying, well, I'm going to judge what you say based on logical consequences. I'm going to judge what you say based on how well the argument works. Right. So I think Reid is someone that you might be more interested in the future just because of the great performance he did in this essay. All right, let's end this and let's go talk about all that. Bye to everybody who's watching.